You don't have a money problem. You have a memorized emotional pattern that keeps recreating the same financial reality over and over again. That might sound uncomfortable. Good, because if you keep thinking money is just about strategy, effort, or discipline, you'll keep missing the real mechanism running your life behind the scenes. Most people never realize this. Your brain isn't wired to make you rich. It's wired to keep you familiar. And if struggle, scarcity, or uncertainty have been emotionally repeated in your life long enough, your system starts to treat them as normal, not logical, not ideal, just familiar. So even when you try to grow, earn more, or change your financial situation, something invisible pulls you back. You procrastinate, you hesitate, you make decisions that don't fully make sense, and then you blame the market, your job, or your lack of opportunities. But what if the real issue isn't outside you? What if your nervous system has been conditioned to reject financial expansion because it doesn't recognize it as safe? This is where things start to get deeper, because money, at its core, isn't just a number. It's a reflection of internal patterns built through years of repeated thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Think about it. How do you feel when you think about money? Pressure, anxiety, urgency, fear of losing? Those emotions are not random. They are signals of a system that has memorized survival. And survival mode doesn't create wealth. It protects what's already known. This is why some people can learn everything about investing, business, or saving, and still stay stuck in the same place. Because information alone doesn't change a conditioned brain. As explored in the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, the body often becomes the subconscious mind. And once the body is used to certain emotional states, it starts to crave them, even when they are limiting. So if your system is addicted to stress, urgency, or lack, it will unconsciously recreate situations that produce those same emotions. Not because you want it, but because your system is trying to stay consistent with what it knows. This is the part most people never see. They think they're chasing money. But in reality, they're repeating emotional patterns. And until that changes, no strategy will ever feel stable. Because the moment things start improving, something inside you will find a way to bring you back to the familiar baseline. Not intentionally, automatically. And once you begin to see this clearly, a new question emerges. One that most people avoid their entire lives. If your financial reality is a reflection of your internal state, then what exactly have you been practicing emotionally every single day without realizing it? There's a version of you that already knows how to create financial stability, but you've trained yourself not to listen to it. Not because you're incapable. But because your attention has been hijacked by louder, more familiar signals, ones that keep reinforcing the same internal state. Most people believe change requires more effort, more discipline, more hustle, more control. But what they don't see is this. If your attention is constantly locked onto problems, pressure, and urgency, your brain keeps firing the same circuits, and your body keeps feeling the same emotions. And without realizing it, you keep rehearsing the same financial identity. Over and over again, you wake up and immediately think about what's missing. You check your bank account with tension. You make decisions from a place of, "I need to fix this fast," and that internal pressure becomes your baseline. Not occasionally, daily. This is how repetition works, not through actions alone, but through emotional consistency. Your system doesn't learn from what you want. It learns from what you feel repeatedly. So even if you say you want abundance, if your dominant emotional state is stress, your brain and body are being trained in scarcity, quietly, automatically. And here's where it becomes almost invisible, because it feels normal. It feels like this is just how life is. But that feeling is conditioning. Your nervous system has adapted to a certain rhythm, a certain chemistry, a certain internal environment. And anything outside of that, like ease, flow, or financial expansion, can actually feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. So what happens? You unconsciously pull away from opportunities. You overthink simple decisions. You delay actions that could move you forward. Not because you're lazy, but because your system is trying to return to its known emotional set point. This is the silent loop most people live in. They think they're making logical decisions about money. But in reality, they're reacting from memorized emotional patterns. And those patterns are sustained by one powerful force: where you place your attention every single day. Because attention is not neutral. Attention is instruction. Whatever you continuously focus on, you reinforce. Whatever you reinforce becomes easier to repeat. And whatever becomes easy to repeat starts to define who you are. So if your attention has been trained to scan for lack, risk, and uncertainty, then your internal state is being shaped accordingly, not once, but thousands of times, until it becomes automatic. And when something is automatic, it no longer feels like a choice, it feels like reality. But here's the unsettling part most people never question. If your attention has been unconsciously rehearsing scarcity, then what would happen if you interrupted that pattern, even slightly? Would your system resist it? Would it feel unnatural? Or would it reveal something you've been overlooking this entire time? The most dangerous financial habit you have is the one that feels completely normal. It's not overspending. It's not lack of knowledge. It's not even fear of failure. It's the unconscious need to return to a familiar emotional state, even when that state is quietly keeping you stuck. Because your brain doesn't measure success the way you think it does. It measures consistency. And if your internal world has been shaped by years of uncertainty, pressure, or instability, then anything outside of that pattern can feel like a threat. Not logically, biologically. This is where the invisible problem begins. Imagine this. An opportunity shows up. A new idea, a chance to earn more, grow, expand. On the surface, you want it, but underneath, your system starts to react. Your thoughts become noisy. You start questioning everything. You feel a subtle tension in your body. And suddenly, what once felt exciting now feels overwhelming. So you pause. You delay. You tell yourself, maybe later. But later never comes. Because that moment wasn't about the opportunity. It was about your internal state being pushed outside its comfort zone. And your nervous system did exactly what it was trained to do. Return you to what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is limitation. This is why so many people sabotage growth without realizing it. They don't see the pattern. They only see the result. Missed chances, repeated cycles, financial stagnation, and over time, they build a story. Maybe I'm just not good with money. But that story is just a surface explanation. Underneath it, something much more precise is happening. Your body has memorized a set of emotions tied to your past experiences. Moments of stress, moments of lack, moments where things didn't work out. And instead of those experiences staying in the past, they became part of your internal baseline. So now, when life presents something new, your system doesn't respond based on possibility. It responds based on memory. This is the invisible threat, because it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like logic. It feels like being careful. It feels like thinking things through. But in reality, it's your past trying to recreate itself through your present decisions. And the more this loop repeats, the stronger it becomes. Because repetition doesn't just reinforce behavior, it reinforces identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who almost makes it, tries, but doesn't follow through, starts, but doesn't sustain. And once identity is involved, the pattern becomes even harder to break. Not because it's permanent, but because it feels like you. So the real question isn't, why aren't things changing? The real question is, what invisible pattern is your system protecting that you've mistaken for who you are? You've probably told yourself at some point, I just need to be more disciplined with money. But if that were true, it would have worked by now, because this isn't about discipline. It's about identity, and more specifically, the version of you that has been shaped by years of repeated emotional experiences you never consciously chose, but kept reinforcing anyway. Look closely at your patterns, not what you say you want, but what you consistently do. You might start strong. You get motivated. You make a plan. You feel like this time will be different. But then, slowly, something shifts. You lose focus. You get distracted. You go back to old habits. And it's subtle. So subtle that you barely notice when it happens, until you look back and realize you're in the same place again. This is where most people become frustrated. They think they lack consistency, but what they're actually experiencing is something deeper. A mismatch between who they're trying to become and who their system has been conditioned to be. Because your brain and body are always working together to maintain a familiar identity. Not a better one, not a richer one, a familiar one. So if you've spent years associating money with stress, pressure, or unpredictability, then becoming financially stable doesn't just require new actions. It requires becoming someone your system doesn't yet recognize. And that creates internal friction. You may not call it that, You might call it, "I'm not feeling it today. I'll start again tomorrow. This isn't the right time." But underneath those thoughts, there's a deeper process happening. Your body is pulling you back toward emotions it already knows how to feel. Because familiar emotions feel safe, even when they limit you. This is why people repeat cycles they consciously want to escape. Not because they enjoy them, but because those cycles are known. And the unknown, even if it's better, can feel unstable. So your system does something very intelligent and very limiting. It chooses predictability over possibility. And that choice happens below your awareness. Over and over again, until it becomes your identity. You begin to say things like, "That's just how I am with money. I've always struggled with this. I'm not the type of person who gets ahead financially." But those statements are not facts. They are conclusions drawn from repeated experiences. Experiences that were reinforced emotionally, not consciously designed. And the more you repeat them, the more your brain wires them in, the more your nervous system memorizes them. The more automatic they become, until one day, you're no longer questioning the pattern. You're defending it, and that's when it becomes truly invisible. Because now it's not just something you do, it's something you believe you are. But if identity is built through repetition, then what would happen if the repetition changed? Not dramatically, not all at once. But just enough to interrupt the pattern you've been unconsciously reinforcing for years? If changing your financial life were just about learning new strategies, why do you keep returning to the same results? At some point, you have to face something uncomfortable. It's not that you don't know what to do. It's that something in you resists becoming the person who actually does it consistently. And that creates tension, because on one side, you have intention. You want more stability. More freedom. More control over your time and money. But on the other side, you have a system that has been emotionally trained to operate in a completely different way. So every time you try to move forward, you feel a subtle internal conflict. Part of you says, "This is the right move." Another part quietly pulls you back, not with force, but with hesitation, distraction, doubt. And this is where most people misinterpret what's happening. They think the problem is lack of motivation. But motivation isn't the issue, because motivation is temporary. Conditioning is persistent. Your brain doesn't care about your goals as much as it cares about maintaining a predictable internal state. So when you try to step into something new, like earning more, managing money better, or thinking long-term, your system detects a mismatch, and that mismatch creates discomfort, not pain. Just enough unease to make you slow down, second guess, or stop altogether. This is why you can feel inspired one day and completely disconnected the next. It's not random. It's the result of two different patterns competing for control. The future you're trying to create, and the past you've been emotionally rehearsing. And here's the tension most people never resolve. You cannot create a new financial reality with the same emotional patterns that created the current one. But letting go of those patterns doesn't feel natural, because they've been practiced, repeated. reinforced, for years, so when you try to shift, your system reacts as if something is off, even if what you're moving toward is objectively better. This is why people stay stuck in cycles they clearly see. They're not blind, they're conditioned. And breaking conditioning isn't about force, it's about awareness. Because the moment you start noticing these patterns as they happen, not after, but during, you begin to separate from them. Slightly, not completely, but enough to create a gap. And in that gap, something interesting happens. You realize that the urge to go back to old behaviors isn't you. It's a memorized response, a familiar signal, a learned loop. And once you see it that way, the dynamic begins to shift. Not instantly, but noticeably. Because now, instead of being inside the pattern, you're observing it. And that changes your relationship with it. But here's the part that creates even more tension. If awareness starts to loosen the pattern, then why do most people avoid becoming fully aware of what they're doing? What is it exactly that feels so uncomfortable about seeing yourself clearly in real time? What if the reason you haven't changed your financial reality yet isn't because it's hard, but because you've been practicing the wrong internal state every single day? Not intentionally, but consistently. Because once you understand this, something shifts. You stop asking, "What should I do next?" And you start asking a much more powerful question. What am I rehearsing internally, without realizing it? Because your life doesn't move in the direction of your goals. It moves in the direction of your most familiar state of being. And for most people, that state is rooted in survival. Thinking about money only when there's pressure. Making decisions from urgency. Feeling relief only when something is fixed. That cycle feels productive. But it's not. It's reactive. And reactive patterns don't create expansion. They maintain continuity. So if you've been waiting for the right moment to change your financial situation, you might be waiting inside the very pattern that keeps resetting your progress. Now here's where the possibility begins. Not in changing everything overnight. But in realizing that your internal state is something you can observe and eventually influence. Because if your brain and body learned these patterns through repetition, then they can also learn something new the same way. Not through force, but through consistency of awareness. This is where most people underestimate the process. They think change has to feel dramatic to be real. But the most powerful shifts are often subtle, almost invisible at first. It might look like this. You notice the moment you start feeling pressure about money. And instead of reacting automatically, you pause, just for a second. You don't fix anything. You don't force a new thought. You just become aware. And that awareness interrupts the loop. Slightly. But that slight interruption matters. Because it creates space. And in that space, your system is no longer running purely on autopilot. Now, this doesn't mean everything changes instantly. It won't. Because your body will still try to pull you back into familiar emotions. That's what it's trained to do. But every time you notice the pattern without immediately acting on it, you weaken its grip. Not dramatically, but progressively. And over time, those small interruptions begin to accumulate. They begin to signal something new to your brain and nervous system. We are not the same as before. And that's when a different kind of possibility emerges. Not the kind based on hope, but the kind based on internal evidence. Because now, you're not just thinking differently. You're experiencing yourself differently. And when that starts to happen, your relationship with money begins to shift in ways that don't rely on external circumstances. But here's the part most people aren't prepared for. If you stop reacting the way you always have, who do you become in those moments of uncertainty? At some point, you have to confront a quiet truth. If you're no longer reacting the way you used to, you can't go back to being who you were. And that's where things start to feel different. Not easier, just unfamiliar. Because for the first time, you're not being pulled entirely by your past. You're starting to notice the space between what you feel and what you choose. And in that space, something subtle begins to shift. You catch yourself before spiraling into stress. You pause before making impulsive decisions. You observe the urge to react without immediately obeying it. And it feels strange, almost like you're interrupting a version of yourself that used to run automatically. Because you are. This is the beginning of an internal turning point. Not a breakthrough that changes everything overnight, but a quiet separation between you and the patterns you've been living in. And once that separation begins, your relationship with money and with yourself starts to evolve. Because now, instead of being immersed in familiar emotions, you're witnessing them, and that changes their power. Think about it. If stress used to dictate your financial decisions, but now you can notice stress without instantly acting from it, then stress is no longer in control. It's just information, a signal your body learned over time, but not something that has to define your behavior. This is where many people feel disoriented, because they've spent years identifying with their reactions. I'm stressed. I'm bad with money. I always mess this up. But now, those statements start to feel less solid. Less absolute, because you're beginning to see that what you thought was you was actually a set of repeated patterns, and patterns can change, not instantly, but inevitably, if they are no longer being reinforced the same way. This is where your attention becomes even more important, because now it's no longer just reacting to the environment. It's being directed, gently, intentionally. You start choosing where to place your focus. Not perfectly, but consciously. And that changes what your brain begins to prioritize, what your nervous system begins to register as relevant, what your body begins to memorize moving forward. This is how a new internal state starts forming, not through force, but through consistent awareness paired with subtle redirection. And over time, that new state begins to feel more natural, more stable, less dependent on external conditions. But here's where the real shift begins to reveal itself. When your internal state changes, your perception changes. And when your perception changes, the way you interpret opportunities, risks, and decisions starts to transform as well. Things you once avoided now feel approachable. Things that once triggered pressure now feel manageable. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And once that shift becomes noticeable, a deeper realization starts to emerge. If you are no longer the same person internally, then what kind of financial reality are you now aligned with creating? It's not that your life suddenly changes, it's that you no longer experience it the same way. And that changes everything, because what once triggered stress now creates awareness. What once felt urgent now feels observable. And what once controlled your decisions now passes through you without the same intensity. This is the phase most people don't talk about, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There's no big announcement, no sudden transformation others can clearly see. But internally, something is reorganizing. Your emotional patterns are no longer running unchecked. Your attention is no longer scattered across every problem. Your system is beginning to stabilize in a new way. And with that stability comes something most people have never experienced consistently: coherence. Not perfection, not constant positivity, but a sense that your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions are no longer pulling in different directions. They begin to align, quietly, naturally. And when that happens, your relationship with money starts to feel different. Not because you forced new behaviors, but because the internal state driving those behaviors has changed. You no longer react to financial situations with the same urgency. You don't feel the same pressure to fix everything immediately. You start making decisions from a place that feels grounded. And that grounded state creates clarity. Because when your system isn't overwhelmed by familiar stress signals, your brain can process information differently. You start seeing options you didn't notice before. You begin to interpret situations with less distortion. You respond instead of react. And this is where integration begins. Not as a concept, but as a lived experience. Because now, the patterns you've been interrupting are no longer as dominant. They still appear, but they don't take over. And that changes how repetition works. Before, you were unconsciously repeating survival-based emotions. Now, you're gradually reinforcing a different internal experience. One that isn't driven by lack. One that isn't anchored in pressure. And the more this new state is experienced, even in small moments, the more familiar it becomes. Until one day, it starts to feel normal. Not forced, not practiced, just natural. And when something becomes natural, it no longer requires the same level of effort to maintain. This is the transition most people never reach. Because they stop too early. They look for immediate external results and miss the internal shift that makes those results sustainable. But you're beginning to see something different. That change isn't about controlling every outcome. It's about transforming the internal environment from which those outcomes are created. And as that internal environment stabilizes, a quiet question starts to form. If this new state becomes your baseline, what kind of financial life unfolds from it, without force, without urgency, and without returning to who you used to be? At the end of all this, nothing about money actually changed first. You did, and that's why most people never reach this point, because they spend their entire lives trying to control the external while ignoring the internal patterns that keep recreating the same results. But now, something is different. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. You no longer chase money with the same emotional urgency. You don't feel defined by what you have or don't have. And most importantly, you're no longer reacting from the same memorized identity. Because that identity has been dissolving, piece by piece, through awareness, through interruption, through a shift in how you experience yourself in real time. And this is where everything begins to integrate, not as something you practice occasionally, but as something you are consistently. Your thoughts are no longer dominated by lack. Your emotions are no longer anchored in pressure. Your attention is no longer trapped in old loops. And because of that, your actions start to reflect a different internal order. You make decisions with more clarity. You respond instead of react. You move forward without the same resistance that once felt normal. And here's the part most people would overlook. It doesn't feel like you're trying to improve your financial life anymore. It feels like you're no longer interfering with it, because the patterns that used to disrupt your progress are no longer running the same way. They've lost their intensity, their control, their automatic nature. And in that space, something new stabilizes. A different relationship with money. One that isn't built on stress, fear, or urgency, but on internal coherence. On a nervous system that no longer needs to return to survival as its default. This aligns with the neuroscience principles explored by Dr. Joe Dispenza, where true change isn't about forcing new outcomes, but about becoming someone whose internal state naturally produces them. And when that shift happens, money stops being something you chase. It becomes something that reflects who you've become. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because now, your internal environment is no longer working against you. It's aligned. And when alignment becomes your baseline, your external reality has no choice but to reorganize around it. Not instantly, but inevitably. So the real question was never, how do I make more money? It was always, who am I being every single day that keeps creating the same result? And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Which means one thing. From this point forward, every financial outcome you experience will no longer feel random. It will feel connected.